All right, so good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to our next session for our Module 1, Session 2, which is Introduction to IT Project Management. This is going to be just the continuation of our last session, which we talked about different topics with regards to the Introduction to IT Project Management, which is Module 1, Session 1. If you haven't watched that session, you can just feel free to go to this channel and look for Module 1, Session 1 so that you can follow along in today's session. All right, so the overview for this session is that we've already crashed out those parts that we've discussed last session. We already defined what IT project is. We've identified the characteristics of an IT project. We've explained project constraints. But for now in this session, we're going to be describing the agile mindset. What does it mean to be able to have a mindset in such a way that we're able to have a process and agile in our project? We're going to be comparing Agile and Waterfall, which one's efficient, which one's for long term, and how do we specify the projects and which methods do we need to use in order for us to actually nail a good system processed. Next is identify a simple IT project idea. We're going to make some examples and scenarios with regards to or in relates to the Agile and Waterfall and their use cases. So review from your Module 1, Session 1. I'm just going to ask you a couple questions before we actually move on to the warm-up questions to this session. So first is, what is an IT project? Now recall from your Session 1, an IT project means it has a temporary effort, meaning it has start and an end. It solves what? A unique problem. It solves a unique problem and it answers a unique solution. Now, what is the difference between project and operation? Recall from your session one, a project is what? It has a clear start and an end, just like as what we've defined an IT project. Now, what is an operation? An operation is a project that is continuous and it's maintainable. Now, why do we put limitations to a project? Now, recall that every project has constraints. Every project or every constraint has its limits so that we can specify a solution to a specific problem. Now, adding a feature to a constraint that isn't really related to the project that you're building could cause a failure to your project because you're not specifying a solution to the problem that you're trying to solve. Now, what are the four constraints? Now, these four constraints, recall, there are scope, we have also time, we also have a cost, and quality. Now, what happens to a project if we remove at least one out of the four constraints? Now, there's a high chance that that specific project that you're trying to build will most likely fail. Now, since we're done with our Module 1 session 1 review, we always start with a warm-up question before we start with our today's session. So, why do IT project needs planning? I'll give you 5 seconds to actually exercise your mind to have an idea based on what are we going to be discussing in today's lesson or today's session. Why do IT project needs planning? I'll give you 5 seconds to answer. Okay, so the reason why we need to have proper planning of every IT project is that it needs to have a proper pacing or a proper way to actually build the system systematically. One of the reasons is that it makes us organize. It helps us to be able to think properly on how do we properly execute on the projects that we're trying to build. Next is, what is one risk in building a project or software? Now recall from our module 1, we simply think a project that it follows four constraints: the scope, time, cost, and quality. Now, the only thing that is one risk in building these is by not following or being able to remove at least one constraint which causes your project to fail. That's one of the risks. And by not being able to follow a methodology which we're going to be discussing today. So that is why we're going to be discussing and continuing our session two today. We're going to be talking more about methodologies and agile and waterfall method. So recall project constraints. This was from session one. We have scope, time, cost, and quality. Now we have examples here. This is from your Let's Practice activity last session one. We've able to identify scope, time, cost, and resources and quality. So I assume that all of you have already submitted your Google Forms and answered each of these constraints. Now in this example, we have an enrollment system for the scope. These are the current scope that we're trying to build. Now, for the time, we were able to finish it in 2 weeks, which is kind of unrealistic. But for this example, we'll just use that time frame. And for the cost and resources, we have limited budget, laptop, server, and database, and we can actually add more to it. And for the quality, we can assume that this one is for the client's feedback. It works without any bugs. The system is very responsive. Now, however, what happens if one of these or the client will make some suggestions? So this is actually a problem. So let's say, for example, in scope, in the enrollment system, they want to add OTP feature. For time, now instead of finishing in 2 weeks, since we need to add a new scope, it affected the time, so we need to extend a month production by adding that feature. Now for cost and resources, we need to make more efficient, so we need to add more devices. Hence, this is for the lessons that we're going to be tackling today. How do we manage these projects in order for us to have a proper execution? Hence, why do we need methodologies? So, how teams plan, build, and deliver IT projects. That's the introduction to how we properly processed and properly execute every plan of the project. Because recall in session one, right, we've already set the foundations of building a project. We know operations, we know project, we know how to build a project, we already know or can define what project means, and we already know the four constraint which makes up the building block of a project. However, how do we execute each of these constraints without any direction? Hence, why we need methodologies. Now, a methodology is a structured way of planning, developing, and managing a product. Recall, structured way of planning, developing, and managing a product or managing a project. Now, every methodology requires what? Careful planning, different types of phasing in order for you to develop something, requires careful collaboration as well, so that you'll be able to properly structure your project before you deliver it to your clients. Now, there are different types of methodologies in this discussion. We're going to be talking more about waterfall and agile methodologies, and we're going to be differentiating them one by one. First is we're going to be defining waterfall methodology. So waterfall methodology, or waterfall method for short, is a traditional approach. So this one is a sequential process or one step at a time, meaning that each process requires what? Careful planning. So it starts from phase one and it requires maybe a week or months of planning before they move on to the analysis, sort of like a waterfall pattern. Now each phase is completed before the next, meaning that they have to complete the first phase before they move to the other phase, and requires, once again, I've said earlier, careful planning from the beginning up until the very end. However, the problem for this traditional approach is that it has difficulty in making changes later whenever a client suggested some new features. Now, in this example, let's say for example, we're going to use waterfall methodology. We already have the four constraints and we're already building the school enrollment system. So in the first phase, they're already done with requirement gathering, analysis, design, coding. Everyone is happy because the client's initial requests are already being implemented and now they are on the testing phase. However, there is a problem. Suddenly, the client suggested can we add online payment and QR code attendance? So what happens is that from the testing phase, they have to actually move on to the operations before they go back again for the square one, which is going back to the careful planning again with requirement gathering. So they have to go back to this process. That process is actually slow. Water methodology is a more traditional approach, meaning that if you're going to go back and start something, adding new feature, you're going to require for your team to actually what? Carefully plan again and again until you go back to the operation and deliver it to your client. So what is a more flexible approach? Hence, there is what Agile methodology is for. Now, Agile methodology is a flexible approach. Now, recall from a waterfall method, water, waterfall methodology is more of like a traditional approach, meaning it goes step by step and requires careful planning. It needs to undergo one phase before it moves on to other phase, and then whenever they make changes, they have to complete all the phases before they reassess again. That is a waterfall methodology. However, in the agile methodology, it is more of a flexible approach. It builds small features first, it shows them to the client, it receives a feedback, makes improvements, and repeats the process. It's pretty much self-explanatory. It requires small features first. Let's say, for example, in this scenario, we build a food mobile application. Now, the client suggested that we need to add a login page, food section, and order mechanics. So in waterfall method, this requires a long process of careful planning. If specific phases are implemented before they are going to update based on the client's request. However, in the agile method, the client creates a request, the developer builds the request, so there is an endless cycle of improvements towards the system. Now, to further solidify the comparison between the two, waterfall finishes one phase before the next. It's like a waterfall. Imagine like a waterfall wherein it goes from another stream, and once the other stream fills up, it goes down again. So careful planning from phase one and before they move on to the next phase. And waterfall and agile builds in small parts. No, recall waterfall is one phase before the next. Agile builds in small parts, meaning that it requires a cycle based on the client's request and the developer's request. So they're collaborating together to create small requests over time and then creates what? A new update to their system. In waterfall, it is best when requirements rarely change, meaning that this happens usually on bigger projects. And since it requires careful planning, the requirements actually rarely change because they've already planned in the first place on the first phase before they actually move on to the next. While in Agile, it is best when requirements may change. This is on a short term, meaning if the client wants to add something, the developers responds, and once they confirm, they're going to make updates to the system that they're building or the project that they're building. For Waterfall, one final delivery, meaning they have to one-shot everything because everything is carefully planned already. For the Agile, there is a frequent working version. When we say frequent working version, it requires a short-term hold from the project that you're building. Meaning, like I've said earlier, when the client creates a request, there is a cycle between the developers, collaboration between the client, so that they what? Create different versions of the project, hence they improve it. Now, here's the example of waterfall and agile based on the system. Now notice that waterfall works on bigger systems like school payroll system, government tax system. Usually these projects are paid and they have to one shot and carefully plan everything. Not unless if they're going to maintain something, it requires reassessing and it takes a lot of time to actually rebuild everything. For Agile, you notice in these use cases, we have mobile apps, food delivery apps. It requires constant updates, meaning that, from your experience in food delivery apps, they usually have updates probably in a month or a week. It requires short-term process. Now, the question here is that is Agile better than Waterfall? Now, most likely, some of you had assumed that you'll say Agile is way better because it requires short-term process. It requires a shorter cycle between the client's requests and the developer's requests, unlike Waterfall that it requires one phase at a time and it needs to one-shot everything before they implement another implementation based on the client's requests. However, the answer to that is no. Agile isn't really necessarily better than Waterfall. Neither of these method is better than the other because the best methodology depends on the project requirements, the client, the budget, the timeline, and how often changes are expected. So you don't need to compare them because whichever methods work really depends on the project requirements and the other constraints here in this list. Now that ends our session. So I want you to actually go to your forms and answer your let's practice activity and as well as your reflection. But before we completely end the session, I want us to review first what is Waterfall and Agile. Waterfall is a step-by-step process. It's more like a traditional process. It is sequential. It is carefully planned before they move on to the other phase, while the agile method is more of like a flexible phase, meaning that every client's request has a quick response to the developer. So there's a constant short-term change and creating from the older version to the newer version. So that's it for our Module 1 Session 2. If you have any other questions and concerns, you can ask me to our group chat. And I've already prepared as well our Google Forms for this session as well. And I'll be sending you some updates with regards to the new Module 2 maybe next week for our next topic. Thank you so much, and I'll see you guys to the next lesson.